The sound of porcelain shattering against the imported Italian marble floor was loud, but it was the silence that followed which truly deafened me. It was a silence so heavy, so suffocating, that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving us all gasping in a vacuum of cruelty. Then came the sound that haunts my nightmares, not a scream, not a cry, but the dry, rhythmic sound of clapping, slow, deliberate applause coming from the head of the table. "That is how a mother teaches her son," the woman said, her voice dripping with an icy satisfaction that made my blood freeze in my veins. "Discipline is the highest form of love, Julian. She will thank you for it later. My name is Evelyn Sterling. I am 60 years old. For 35 of those years, I have been a shark in the courtroom, a senior partner at one of San Francisco's most prestigious litigation firms. I have destroyed corporate monopolies, negotiated billion-dollar settlements, and looked into the eyes of cold-blooded killers without blinking. I built a reputation on being unbreakable, a fortress of logic and law. But nothing in my 3 decades of legal warfare prepared me for the sight of my only daughter, Claire. Crumpled on the floor of a dining room in Pacific Heights, a red handprint blooming on her cheek like a grotesque flower, while her husband stood over her and his mother applauded. This is not just a story about a bad marriage. This is a story about how the veneer of wealth and privilege can hide the most rot, and how a single Sunday evening dinner unraveled a legacy of violence that had been festering for generations. It is the story of how I had to stop being a lawyer and start being a mother, and how we learned that the most dangerous monsters do not hide in the dark alleys, but in the well-lit dining rooms of the elite. Let me take you back to that evening. It was November 12th. The date is burned into my mind because it was the 3rd anniversary of my husband Marcus's passing. Marcus had been a cardiologist, a man of infinite patience and warmth, the complete opposite of the world I fought in every day. Since his death, the silence in my Victorian home in Noe Valley had become a physical weight. Claire, my brilliant artistic Claire, an architect who used to design skyscrapers with eyes full of starlight, had insisted I not spend the evening alone. "Come over, Mom," she had said on the phone, her voice sounding thin, stretched tight like a violin string about to snap. "Julian is having his mother over. We'll make Dad's favorite roast. It will be nice." It was never nice at the Thorne residence. Julian Thorne was 31, a venture capitalist with a smile that could charm the skin off a snake and eyes that never quite warmed up. He was the golden boy of Silicon Valley, handsome, wealthy, and terrifyingly precise, and behind him always loomed Victoria Thorne, his mother. Victoria was a relic of old San Francisco money, a woman who wore her widowhood like a crown and treated people like chess pieces. Her husband, Arthur, had died 20 years prior in a fall from their penthouse terrace, a tragedy that had been ruled an unfortunate accident after a party. When I arrived at their mansion at 7 o'clock, the rain was lashing against the bay windows, creating a cage of water around the house. The atmosphere inside was brittle. The table was set with military precision. Crystal glasses aligned perfectly, silverware polished to a mirror shine. Claire was in the kitchen, and when I saw her, my heart sank. She was wearing a long-sleeved turtleneck dress, unusual for the warm heating of the house. She looked diminished. That is the only word for it. My daughter, who used to fill a room with her laughter and her blueprints, now seemed to occupy less space, moving with a hesitation that set my nerves on edge. "You look tired, darling," I said, reaching out to touch her arm. She flinched. It was microscopic, a reflex she tried to hide instantly, but I saw it. I saw the terror in her eyes before she masked it with a fragile smile. "Just work, Mom," she whispered. "The new project is demanding. Julian likes things to be perfect." We sat down for dinner. Julian sat at the head, Victoria to his right, me across from her, and Claire sandwiched between the two forces that controlled her life. The conversation was a minefield. Victoria spent the first course dissecting Claire's appearance, her hosting skills, her choice of napkins. "This roast is a bit dry, don't you think, Julian?" Victoria asked, slicing the meat with surgical precision. One would think that with all the time Claire spends at home now that she's stepped back from the firm, she could master a simple oven temperature. Claire had not stepped back from her architecture firm. She had been pushed, slowly, systematically, under the guise of focusing on the family they were planning to build. I watched my daughter swallow the criticism, her hand trembling as she reached for her water glass. "I'm sorry, Victoria," Claire murmured, her eyes fixed on her plate. "I'll do better next time." Julian didn't look at her. He just swirled his red wine, the crimson liquid coating the glass. "You know how Mother likes it, Claire. It's about attention to detail. If you can't manage the small things, how can we trust you with the big ones?" The tension ratcheted up with every tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. I tried to steer the conversation to neutral ground, talking about a case I had won, but Victoria cut me off with a wave of her diamond-clad hand. "Women who work too much often lose touch with their true purpose, Evelyn. Perhaps that is why Claire struggles. She didn't have a model of domestic submission growing up." I gripped my fork until my knuckles turned white. "My husband and I raised a brilliant, independent woman, Victoria. We didn't raise a servant." The air crackled. Julian looked at me with a cold, dead stare. And then it happened. Claire, sensing the impending explosion, tried to pour more wine into Julian's glass to distract him. Her hand, shaking from the stress, slipped. A splash of red wine, no larger than a coin, landed on the pristine white tablecloth. The world stopped. Julian slowly placed his napkin on the table. He looked at the stain, then at Claire. The look wasn't angry. It was disappointed, the way one looks at a dog that has soiled the carpet. "You are clumsy," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "I am so sorry," Claire stammered, reaching for a cloth. "I'll get it out. Club soda will." She never finished the sentence. Julian stood up. The motion was fluid, practiced. He didn't wind up. He just swung. The back of his hand connected with Claire's cheek with a sickening crack. The force of it threw her out of her chair and onto the marble floor. I sat there, frozen for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, my brain processed 35 years of legal precedents, criminal statutes, and the agonizing realization that I had missed the signs. And then, I heard the applause. Victoria was clapping, lightly, politely, as if she had just witnessed a successful piano recital. "That is how she learns," Victoria said. The freeze response broke. I did not scream. I did not throw wine. I became Evelyn Sterling, Esquire. I stood up, pulled my phone from my clutch, and hit the speed dial for Deputy Chief Harrison, a man whose career I had saved 5 years ago and who owed me everything. "What are you doing?" Julian asked, wiping his hand with a napkin. He looked almost bored. "I am calling the police," I said, my voice steady, cold, lethal. "You wouldn't dare," Victoria scoffed, taking a sip of her wine. "This is a family matter. Do not embarrass yourself, Evelyn." Julian was merely correcting her hysteria. "This is Evelyn Sterling," I said into the phone, maintaining eye contact with the monster who had just struck my child. "I require an immediate unit at 2400 Broadway. Domestic violence in progress. Assailant is still on the premises. Victim is injured. I am a witness." Julian laughed. It was a dry, arrogant sound. "You think the police will touch me? Do you know who I am? Do you know who my investors are?" "I know exactly who you are, Julian," I replied, walking over to help Claire, who was sobbing silently on the floor. "You are a felon, and I am going to make sure you never see the outside of a prison cell again." The police arrived in 8 minutes. In that time, Julian poured himself another drink, and Victoria tried to explain to me that I was overreacting, that men need to assert dominance, that her husband Arthur used to do the same, and she was better for it. Every word she spoke was a nail in her own coffin, and she was too arrogant to realize I had already started the recording app on my phone. When the officers entered, led by a sergeant I recognized, the dynamic shifted. Julian tried to play the charming host, explaining that his wife had a manic episode and fell, but the red mark on Claire's face was undeniable, and my testimony was ironclad. They handcuffed him. As they let him out, he looked at Claire, his eyes narrowing. "You are making a mistake, Claire. You are nothing without me. You know that." And Victoria, standing by the fireplace, hissed at me. "You have declared war, Evelyn. You have no idea the forces you have just unleashed." I looked at her, holding my trembling daughter in my arms. "I am the war, Victoria." That night, was the beginning of a descent into hell, but it was also the start of our salvation. I took Claire back to my house in Noe Valley. I put her in her old room, the one with the skylight she used to stare out of as a teenager. She was 29 years old, but that night she looked like a child again, broken and small. I sat by her bed as she slept, or pretended to sleep, and I replayed the last 3 years in my mind. The warning signs were there, flashing like neon lights I had chosen to ignore. The way Julian would subtly critique her outfit before they went out. The way Claire stopped seeing her college friends because Julian didn't think they were ambitious enough. The way she constantly checked her phone, terrified of missing a call from him. We call it coercive control in the legal world. It is a slow poison, colorless and odorless, until it kills you. The next morning, the war Victoria promised began. My firm received a formal complaint filed against me for unethical conduct and conflict of interest. Julian's lawyers, a team of sharks from a rival firm, filed for an emergency hearing, claiming Claire was mentally unstable and a danger to herself, attempting to invalidate her statement. But the worst part was the social isolation. San Francisco society is a small, incestuous circle. Victoria Thorne wielded her influence like a weapon. Within 48 hours, rumors were swirling. People whispered that Claire had been drinking heavily, that she had been self-harming, that poor Julian had been trying to get her help. Claire sat at my kitchen island 3 days later, looking at her phone. Her face was pale, the bruise on her cheek turning a sickly shade of yellow and purple. "They're destroying me, Mom," she whispered. "Look at this." She showed me a post from a mutual friend, someone who had been a bridesmaid at her wedding. It was a vague status update about standing by friends who are falsely accused and the danger of vindictive women. "It's gaslighting on a massive scale," I said, taking the phone away and turning it face down. "They want you to break. They want you to recant." "Maybe I should," Claire said, her voice trembling. "Maybe I did provoke him. I spilled the wine. I knew how much he hated stains. I knew he was stressed about the IPO." I grabbed her shoulders, perhaps a bit too firmly. "Claire Sterling, look at me. Spilling wine is an accident. Hitting your wife is a crime. There is no universe, no reality where you are responsible for his violence. He hit you because he wanted to, because he felt entitled to. But you don't understand, Mom. He loves me. He has a temper. His father was tough on him. And that was the thread I needed to pull. His father." I spent the next week doing what I do best. I investigated. While Julian was out on bail, paid for by Victoria within an hour of his arrest, and while his lawyers bombarded us with motions, I dug into the Thorne family history. I called in favors from private investigators I had used for corporate espionage cases. I accessed archives that weren't digitized. I needed to know about Arthur Thorne. The official story was a tragic fall, a drunken stumble over the railing of the penthouse. But wealthy men don't just fall off balconies without someone noticing. I tracked down the staff who worked for the Thornes 20 years ago. Most were dead or had moved back to their home countries. But there was one name that stood out: Maria Gonzalez. She had been the live-in nurse for Arthur Thorne in his final months. She was listed in the police report as a witness, but her statement was brief, almost non-existent. I found Maria in a small retirement community in Daly City. She was hesitant to speak to me at first. The fear in her eyes when I mentioned the name Thorne was palpable. "Mrs. Thorne is a powerful woman," Maria said, her hands clutching a rosary. "She told me if I ever spoke about that night, she would ensure my son lost his scholarship. My son is a doctor now. I cannot risk his career." "Maria," I said gently, placing a photo of Claire on the table. The photo showed the bruise clearly. "This is my daughter. She is living with the son of the woman you fear. If we don't stop them, he is going to kill her. Just like she killed Arthur." It was a gamble, a wild, desperate accusation. But Maria's face crumbled. "She didn't push him," Maria whispered. "Not with her hands. But she drove him to it. And that night, he didn't fall. He was trying to get away from her. He had a cane. He was frail. She was screaming at him, telling him he was weak, that he was pathetic. He backed away. The railing was loose. She knew it was loose. She had fired the contractor who was supposed to fix it just days before. She watched him lean back. She watched him fall, and she didn't call 911 for 20 minutes. She sat there and finished her drink. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the drafty room. And Julian? I asked. Where was Julian? He was 10 years old, Maria said, crossing herself. He was hiding behind the curtains. He saw everything. And when the police came, Victoria took him aside and told him exactly what to say. She told him, Daddy was drunk and clumsy. We have to be strong. She turned that boy into a vault. She taught him that empathy was weakness and that eliminating problems was strength. I had the ammunition. Now I needed the warhead. Back at home, things were escalating. Julian had started violating the restraining order in subtle ways. Deliveries of flowers with no card, cars parked down the street that drove away when we looked. Emails to Claire's work address from anonymous accounts saying, I forgive you. Claire was fraying. She wasn't sleeping. She paced the hallways at night. He's going to win, Mom, she said one rainy Tuesday. Everyone believes him. His lawyers are saying I have a history of instability. They dug up that time I went to therapy in college after Dad died. They're twisting my grief into madness. They are desperate, I assured her, though I felt the walls closing in myself. Then came the night that changed everything. It was 3 weeks after the dinner. I was late coming back from the office, preparing the affidavit for Maria. I had left Claire with a security guard I had hired, a burly ex-cop named Miller. When I turned onto my street, I saw police lights. My heart stopped. I abandoned my car in the middle of the road and ran. The front door of my house was smashed open. Inside, it looked like a hurricane had passed through. Furniture overturned, mirrors shattered. Miller was sitting on the steps, bleeding from a head wound, being attended to by paramedics. Where is she? I screamed. Where is my daughter? Miller pointed toward the backyard. I ran through the kitchen, stepping over broken glass. In the garden, under the relentless rain, I found them. Julian was there. He had broken in, bypassing the alarm, and blindsided Miller. He had Claire cornered against the old oak tree Marcus had planted. He was soaking wet, his expensive suit ruined, his eyes wild and manic. He held a landscaping brick in his hand. You are ruining everything, he screamed, his voice cracking. We were perfect. We were the power couple. Why can't you just behave? Why do you have to listen to this witch? Claire was shaking, but she wasn't cowering on the ground this time. She was standing. Because I am not your property, Julian, she yelled back, her voice cutting through the rain. I am not an object you can polish and break whenever you feel like it. I love you, he roared, raising the brick. That isn't love. I stepped into the garden, my voice booming with every ounce of courtroom authority I possessed. That is possession. And it is over. Julian spun around to face me. You poisoned her against me. My mother was right. You are the cancer. Drop the brick, Julian, I said calmly. The police are already here. Look around you. Red and blue lights were washing over the garden fences. Officers were swarming the perimeter, guns drawn. Julian looked at the police, then at Claire, then at me. For a second, I saw the scared 10-year-old boy hiding behind the curtains. Then I saw the monster Victoria had cultivated. He dropped the brick, not in surrender, but in disgust. This is all a misunderstanding, he said, smoothing his wet hair, his face instantly shifting into a mask of sanity. My wife is hysterical. I was just trying to calm her down. Officer Martinez tackled him before he could finish the sentence. The aftermath of that night broke the dam. The violation of the restraining order, the assault on a security guard, and the attempted assault on Claire were too much even for Victoria's money to bury. Julian was held without bail. But the real victory came 2 days later. I went to visit Victoria Thorne. She was sitting in her drawing room, drinking tea, pretending her world wasn't collapsing. Get out of my house, she said without looking up. I placed a file on the table. It contained Maria's sworn affidavit, the maintenance records for the balcony railing from 20 years ago, which I had subpoenaed from the original contractor who had kept them as insurance, and the recording of her applauding while her son beat my daughter. You have 2 choices, Victoria, I said. 1. You liquidate Julian's assets to pay for a settlement that will ensure Claire never has to work again unless she wants to. You step down from the charity boards, and you plead no contest to the charges of obstruction of justice that the district attorney is filing this afternoon based on this evidence. Or 2, we go to trial, and I will put Maria on the stand. I will reopen the investigation into Arthur's death, and I will play the recording of you clapping for an abuser on every news station in the country. She looked at the file. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled. She looked at me with pure, undiluted hatred. You are a vulgar woman, she spat. And you, I replied, are a mother who sacrificed her son's soul to feed her own ego. You created a monster because you were too weak to love a human being. She signed the settlement. The criminal trial for Julian took 6 months. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison for aggravated assault, burglary, and battery. Victoria retreated from society, a pariah in the golden cage she had built. But the real ending of this story isn't a legal victory. It's what happened last week. It has been 2 years since that night. I was sitting in my garden, reading a book. The oak tree where Julian had cornered Claire was now blooming with new leaves. Claire walked out carrying a tray of lemonade. She looks different now. Her hair is cut short, a messy bob that suits her. She wears paint-stained overalls. She opened her own small architecture studio, focusing on sustainable housing for low-income families. She smiles with her whole face now, not just her mouth. She sat down beside me and took my hand. "Mom," she said, "I got a letter from him, from prison." My heart skipped a beat. "Did you read it?" She nodded. "He says he's sorry. He says he's taking anger management classes. He says he realizes now that his mother warped him." "And how do you feel?" I asked. "I feel nothing," she said, looking up at the sky. "For a long time, I hated him. Then I feared him. But now, I just feel pity. He's a tragedy, but I am not. I am a survivor." She squeezed my hand. "You saved me, Mom. You fought when I couldn't." I looked at my daughter, this woman of steel and velvet who had walked through fire and come out the other side. "No, my darling," I said softly. "I just reminded you of who you were. You saved yourself the moment you stood up in that rain and told him no." We sat there in silence, listening to the birds, and I realized something profound. We spend so much time teaching our daughters to be polite, to be accommodating, to keep the peace. We forget to teach them that their voice is a weapon and their dignity is a fortress. The lesson I learned, and the lesson I hope you take from this, is that silence is the accomplice of violence. When we hear the glass shatter, we must not look away. We must not wait for the applause. We must speak. We must act. Because sometimes, the difference between a tragedy and a survival story is just one person refusing to be quiet. And as for me, I still practice law. But now, I specialize in only one thing: helping women find the exit door before the house burns down. Because I know now that the strongest force in the universe isn't a court order or a bank account. It is a mother watching over her child, ready to burn the world down to keep her safe. Sometimes, love doesn't look like a hug. Sometimes, love looks like a witness stand, a recording device, and the absolute refusal to back down.